Welcome to Budget Outlaws. My name is Andrew. Grab some popcorn or beer, as this is going to be a good one. In my last video, we went over how I bought 3 Porsche 914s at age 14 for only $1,000. If you hadn't had the chance to watch that video, check out the link right here. After I purchased the car and went to the Concours event, I tried driving the car more, but it just needed work, especially with the engine. At the time, I was detailing cars for money and only had a few clients a month, so the money wasn't pouring in. But I was able to sell parts from the hoard I had collected from the blue rolled chassis we cut up. So with some horse trading and a lot of parts selling, I slowly started making the car nicer. I found a killer deal on a 5-lug conversion kit, as well as some really nice fake Fluke wheels, and set to putting those bits on, which really woke up the looks of the car. One of the things I did before I pulled the engine out was put fuel injection in. Back in the 80s and 90s, people thought that the fuel injection on the 914s weren't very good, so they would pull them and try and put big Weber carbs on them. That was all well and good, but the Weber carbs didn't make any more power than the fuel injection and generally ran worse. So with this bit of knowledge, I put a good working fuel injection system in the car and then had high idle problems, not to mention some valve adjustment issues. Armed with a dad that was a certified mechanic in a previous life, I set to the task of doing a basic valve adjustment. However, nothing I did seemed to make the car run any better. After trying my hands on a valve adjustment for the 3rd time one Sunday night, I took the car to school the morning following. By now I had just got my driver's license. I get going on the road, but the car was running worse than it did before the new adjustment. Fed up with the car and filled with teenage anger as I was late for school, I slammed the car door shut in the school parking lot. Well, this was a very bad idea, as I didn't have any window strips for the door window, and therefore the glass banged against the metal part of the door and shattered. I spent the better part of the day angry with myself and realized I needed to do something different here. I was already thinking of ways to make the car faster. What teenage boy isn't? When this set me over the top. It was time to look into an engine conversion. 914s, being mid-engined and air-cooled, have an enormous amount of room in the engine bay, as it's extremely wide and considerably long. At the time, the common swaps for the 914 were a Buick V6, a Subaru 4-cylinder, and a small block Chevy V8. I looked around for anything that would work for a couple of months. I also knew I needed some more money, so it was finally time to get a real job. 25 job applications later, and the only person who would sit me down for an interview hired me. That happened to be the local Taco Bell. So, armed with a 20-hour week and a $5.25 per hour paycheck, I was actually able to save up a little money for this engine swap. I had found a couple different swaps for sale, but none of the sellers panned out, or they sold it before I could send the funds. After a bit of time, I found an incomplete V8 conversion kit for sale. In fact, I found 2 of them. I set myself a goal to have the cheapest documented V8 conversion with a rebuilt engine. Using the 2 kits I bought, I made one good kit, sold off the rest of the parts, as well as my old 4-cylinder engine to cover most of my costs. The next step was to get the engine itself. My dad and I went to the local pick and pull on New Year's Day. They had a half-off motor sale, and found a small block Chevy from an early 80s car. My dad was rightfully concerned about me having too much power, so we tried to find something with maybe a 305 motor or similar. During this time, I was getting better and better at autocrossing and driving, as my dad at the time had 2 944 turbos, and I drove one of them to school. So I personally wasn't worried about me having too much power. In the end, we got the motor home from the junkyard, pulled it apart, knowing that we were going to do a cheap rebuild kit, and go to find out it was a 4-bolt main 350 with some smog heads. The heads were going to limit the power, so we were okay with building this one up. I cleaned the engine the best I could on a stand, and we got a hold of a local machine shop to discuss our options. After some time, we decided on a full rebuild kit with a circle track style cam that would move the power band up and try and eliminate some of the torque. We had concerns with the stock 914 transmission holding that much torque. About a month later, we had the engine back, put together, and we were ready to start putting the conversion kit in the car. The supplemental parts for the conversion bit I had bought didn't have a radiator setup, so I was given a very large radiator from a friend of mine, and after some fitting and fabricating, I was able to mount it. Mounting the engine to the trans was as simple as using the adapter with a custom flywheel and clutch. And we ran an HEI distributor, which required the rear firewall in the engine bay to be cut. We ran some ram horn exhaust manifolds and exhaust from one of the conversion kits, as well as a DYNOJET carburetor. One of the main conversion kits I had bought was from a 76 car, so they had smog pumps and a catalytic converter on the exhaust so that they could pass smog. In total, I believe I spent about $2,300 on the conversion to get it running at this point. With the sale of the engine and the associated bits I had with the 4-cylinder, I was down to about $1,000 total invested in the conversion to get it running. We tinkered with it for a few weeks, trying to get everything running right, but it seemed to be just low on power. The seat of the pants said that it had maybe 125 horsepower at best. It wasn't much faster than the 4-cylinder engine. The engine was still breaking in, but it was concerning. After not much time, I lopped off the catalytic converter, found a $20 Holley 600 carburetor at a swap meet, and my dad rebuilt it, and we were well on our way to making some more power. I drove it this way for a bit, but the exhaust was excessively low and was robbing it of some power. Oddly enough, it sounded like a 4-cylinder. It certainly was choking the system. So we changed out the old ram horn exhausts for shorty headers and got a full 2.5-inch system with magnaflow mufflers and resonated tips. But before we made the custom exhaust, we made sure to do an open header start just for fun. The exhaust sounded really good like this and certainly woke up the car. It started to drive a lot differently after this. All the prep work led to one of the yearly 914 events that was in its second year. We worked non-stop the week before the event to make sure that the car was in tip-top shape and ready for the event. This included taking the car to the dyno and getting it tuned, specifically the low-speed driving mannerisms. After making 230 horsepower and 280 foot-pounds of torque at the wheels, we were ready for the road. We trailered the car down to Southern California, where the second West Coast Classic, now West Coast Ramble, was taking place. The year was 2005. Some 100 cars were in attendance, as it was one of the largest recorded 914 gatherings in the world. We spent a couple days driving around the streets of Southern California, including Mulholland Drive.
If the back has to be easier if I move down the road a bit.
If you let us see what the cards are a little bit better, isn't it?
The 914 didn't miss a beat and was a blast to drive around. One of the days we had was the streets of Willow, which is a small racetrack at Willow Springs, which we happen to have to ourselves, the 914 group. My dad and I co-drove the car and we had a blast. However, this was not without its own incidences. The custom V8 conversion clutch and flywheel I had used had a clutch pedal extender to get more throw out of the clutch cable. This pedal extender added leverage to the pivot that the clutch cable runs on, and it happened to run right next to the throttle cable. So ever so often, if things flex just right and the throttle cable and the clutch are moved in the right fashion, the throttle cable gets stuck behind the clutch cable. So if you go to push down the clutch, the throttle cable gets pushed down instead, and the clutch doesn't move much. I had this happen at the end of the main straightaway. Mind you, this was my very first track day, and I'm used to doing 40 to 60 mile an hour autocrosses, not 100 miles an hour at the end of a straight. I had been easy on the brakes all day to just get used to driving quickly, so had a tiny bit extra room to brake. Realizing what was going on with the clutch and throttle, I released the clutch and yanked the car out of gear, barely going off track. A couple stabs of the clutch and throttle labor, and the car was back in business. I pit after limping it around, and we modify a couple things to prevent this issue from rearing its ugly head again for the day. For the years that I had the V8 conversion since, it has happened to me 3 more times. One of these times was when I was giving a lady friend of mine a ride in a residential neighborhood. I didn't earn much cool points there. So we finished off the track day, and the final day was an awards ceremony at Paramount Ranch. Paramount Ranch is a place that Paramount Pictures purchased back in 1927 and built old-style buildings to use for their Western and similar movies. We packed out the place pretty well with over 100 cars. More cars had come by this time. And In-N-Out catered our meal there. All in all, it was a really great weekend. Over the next couple of years, I did a few more events and some autocrossing.
Andrew?
Purchased some modern 17-inch wheels which looked really good with the black primer, and continued to work on the car some more. One of the problems I couldn't seem to get over was the fact that my radiator system just wasn't efficient enough. It would slowly creep up in temp on the freeway, and stop and go meant overheating. I tried a few different things to help cool the motor, and some of them were successful, but in the end, this was one of the main reasons why I decided to change over to another motor setup. I kept tuning with a V8. It never seemed to have enough power. But one of the biggest things I did was put an electronic Holley Commander fuel injection. The projection is what I believe it was called. I replaced the 600 CFM Holley carb with the 600 CFM throttle body fuel injection. One of the coolest things about the system was it was a bolt-on to my aluminum Edelbrock intake, and I could hide it underneath a carb air filter. The fuel injection system really helped pick up low-end torque, and it also got my feet wet into tuning an ECU. I probably added about 75 foot-pounds of torque and maybe another 20 to 30 horsepower. The car was just a tire-smoking monster at this point, and I needed more tire. I need to discuss some of the body modifications to the car. When I first got the car, it was a stock narrow body. And after I got those wrong offset 5-spoke wheels, I had to roll the fenders to make them fit. Then I did the 5-lug conversion and put the 16x7 Fuke wheels with 225 tires. This required a bit more than just rolling the fenders, and I ended up spending some 100 hours pounding the fenders out to have some unique looking flares. But one of the problems with the flares is that while my hammer dolly work was good enough to move the fenders out, it wasn't good enough to prevent the massive amounts of body filler that was needed to make the body smooth. Combine this with the need for more tire, and a wider fender was determined as necessary. I had thoughts of making 944 turbo fenders fit, but ended up something that I would have been putting too much work into, and I stumbled on some brand new high-performance house flares for the rear of the car. A Greyhound bus from Pennsylvania later, and it was time to make the fenders fit. Now, these high-performance house fenders were originally designed to be replacement racing quarter panels, Dutz fastened to the top of the original fenders, so they required a bit of trimming and finishing to be flush mounted to the car. I got the rears done, and after some graciously donated fenders from a friend of mine who happened to be pulling some off the fronts of a race car, I had a full set. After some couple hundred hours on the body later, I had myself a nicely grafted set of flares. As far as I know, I have only seen one other 914 with these fenders custom grafted, and that was just in a photo. Some of you may be asking why I didn't just go with GT fenders. Well, this is an outlaw channel, right? GT fenders, while they look fantastic on a 914, didn't add much to my fender opening, and also didn't have the body line that I was specifically looking for. The high-performance house fenders, on the other hand, had a really subtle side profile and a really nice hip line. I stand behind my decision for the fenders, and I think it's one of the most unique things about my car to this day. Fast forward a few more years, and the ECU takes a shit on the Holley fuel injection system, with a replacement ECU costing some $1,200, which happened to be twice what I paid for the system off of eBay new. I decided just to throw the Holley 600 back on and drive it. At this point, I was recently engaged and was in my own home, and knew that I needed to get the car in paint. I'll go over the whole paint and bodywork process in another video, as I did that all myself. And some 10 years later, it still looks pretty darn good. Some long hours on the paint, I sprayed the car in my garage and got it ready for the wedding. My wife has been very supportive of my 914 affliction, and I can't thank her enough for that. The wedding ends up being great, and the wife and I drive the car to the Taco Bell that we met at. Remember my first job? Took some pictures and drove home. Thus ends the saga of the V8 conversion to my 914. I did one other event in the car, but couldn't get the enthusiasm back for the V8 conversion due to a number of problems after a few more years. But not all is lost. I had an Audi A4 1.8 liter with a big turbo kit that I drove around and really enjoyed. With some long nights of thinking and scheming, I came up with a plan. I was going to put an Audi 1.8 liter motor and trans in my 914 with my big turbo kit as I was selling my Audi and returning it back to stock. Here's a sneak peek of the end results of that. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video about the start of the build of the 1.8 turbo. I have a lot of content on it, and we're going deep into this conversion, how I did it, what problems I had.